Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about how landscape genomics, I don't know if you can see yeah, you can, okay, cool. How we can use landscape genomics to kind of predict tree response to climate change, and we'll be focusing on coast live oak. So we know that there's a lot of global biodiversity threat due to climate change and land use change. And trees are especially vulnerable because they have long generation times. So it takes a long time for them to kind of accumulate these mutations that you need to respond. And then they're also sessile, so they can't just get up and move and track that changing climate. And typically trees are ecosystem founders. So they kind of comprise these networks and support structurally and functionally dozens to thousands of other species. And we know that as those founders kind of disappear, you can have entire ecosystems and those networks collapse as well. So it's really important, how do we help these tree species survive into the future? And we can use landscape genomics to do just that. So what landscape genomics does is it examines the distribution of genetic variation across an entire landscape to kind of understand these patterns of adaptation. And that's especially important in somewhere as ecologically and geographically diverse as California. And so this approach basically looks at neutral, which is not under selection, and adaptive, which is under selection. Genetic variation, we correlate that with environmental gradients, and then we can kind of really get at these conservation tools to identify regions that are going to be vulnerable or resilient under climate change. And then we can also identify genotypes that are important for applications such as assisted dispersal, where we introduce seeds that might be pre-adapted to kind of boost site resilience. And so we partnered with the Nature Conservancy to do just that. We have a map of kind of all of the preserves across California, over 1.5 million acres. So this really provides a lot of habitat for us to examine these questions. And they have great missions to protect and connect wildlands, rewild landscapes, and establish living laboratories. So this allowed us to kind of access these broad ranging species like coast live oak shown, the distribution is shown here in red, which is a foundation species. So it supports thousands of other species above and below ground. So it's really like this ecosystem founder. And it has over 1 million acres across California shown here. 40% are within protected land. So that's actually pretty high, but that also still leaves 60% of its range kind of unprotected. And other threats include sudden oak death, incompatible cattle grazing, and then warming temperatures as well, which is kind of what we're going to be focusing on today. And we're wondering, what populations are going to be vulnerable to these climate changes. So our goals were to identify regions where coast live oak will be vulnerable or resilient to these future climate regimes, and then develop specific recommendations for managing coast live oak populations across 3 TNC focal sites as examples. So we sampled 171 individuals across the range throughout these 10 sampling sites. Sedgwick is here, and then Dangerman Preserve is here. And we really focused more heavily on the TNC focal sites to kind of get a finer scale view of these genetic gradients. And then this is climate water deficit shown in the greens and yellows, with green being less climate water deficit, so more water availability. But you can kind of just see the distribution across our 3 focal sites of the types of water availability there are to plants. And so we're using genomic methods across the whole genome. And what we're doing is we're looking at SNPs. So that's a single nucleotide polymorphism, or just a single nucleotide change. We have 3 individuals here with the same nucleotides, if you remember from biology class, except there's this one position has a different nucleotide. And we can find a bunch of those across a bunch of individuals across the entire genome. And that gives us kind of tools to look at the differences between these individuals and how those might be associated with certain things like climate. So the text is a little messed up here, but basically what we do is we use multivariate statistics to associate those SNPs that we found with climate variables. And we can find putatively adaptive SNPs or genetic loci that are kind of adapted to these certain climate variables. And for our first goal of kind of identifying those vulnerable regions, we can use a tool called genomic offset. And what that does is it tracks the current adaptive variation and looks at how that's going to change under future climate. So here we have a gradient of genotypes represented by these trees on a background of a certain environment, right? So we're assuming local adaptation with these red trees kind of living in this red environment, these green trees living in this green environment. And what we're expecting in the future is this environmental shift, but the trees, like I said, can't get up and move. So these green trees are still going to be there. The red trees are still going to be there, but now they're on a green environment, for example. And that disparity is what we're terming genomic offset. So we can kind of track this difference in the adaptation that will still be there because the trees are still going to be there versus what kind of environment they'll be in and the adaptations they would need to survive in that future environment. So for coast live oak, we found kind of a mosaic of vulnerability across the range. These darker reds indicate more vulnerable. The yellows indicate more resilient or less vulnerable. And we found that the northernmost and southernmost, especially near San Diego, are going to be the most vulnerable parts of the range. And if we zoom in kind of across these coastal mountains, what we actually find is that higher elevation sites are going to be more vulnerable. This is sort of surprising because typical things like ecological niche models are suggesting things are moving upslope, but this is basically suggesting the trees that exist upslope are going to not be adapted to that new climate that's going to exist upslope. But good news is there is patches of resilience, especially along Central California, and Dangermond is in here, which I'll get to in a second. So for our goal to identify regions where they'll be vulnerable and resilient, we found that northern and southernmost extent of the range are going to be the most vulnerable, and those higher elevation parts of the coastal mountains. And then the central coast has these patches of resilience. So we wanted to take that information and make specific recommendations for conservation estates. So we used 3 of TNC's sites for this. So looking specifically at Dangermond Preserve, it's actually along one of these resilient patches, and it's one of the most resilient preserves. So what we would maybe recommend is, the oaks might not be as much in danger there. So maybe just maintain and grow the existing populations using kind of land management tools like selective cattle grazing, remove invasive species, and just protect the water availability. But if you compare it to the other 2 focal sites, Irvine Ranch and Santa Rosa, these seem to be at risk. So our recommendations would be something like doing assisted dispersal or taking seeds from either within the range or outside of the range to increase the site resilience in both of them. And then Irvine Ranch has this kind of lower tree coverage. So you might want to even increase tree coverage there. So how are we going to get to these seeds, right? Where are we going to get these seeds from? And this is really a cool part of the landscape genomics is we can then use this to identify resilient seed sources. So we're kind of talking about the same genomic offset figure that I showed you, except this time we're kind of moving the trees around. And so this brown tree into this green environment, what kind of disparity will that be? And you can move it kind of throughout the range and see, where will that tree be the best seed source for? And so we can do this in Dangermond, take trees from throughout all the range, simulate basically what the offset would be or the vulnerability would be if we move them. So you do this, for all the tree grid cells, and what you get is basically the percent of the range that this grid cell or this kind of bunch of trees would increase resilience. So this is a percentage. So greener is 100% that disappeared, and red is 0%. So really, if you're looking for good seed sources for all of Dangermond, you would start looking at these darker green areas that are good for 100% of this preserve, right? It'll increase the resilience compared to if you just did nothing. But these redder sites might not be the best seed sources. They're not going to increase resilience. And we can even zoom out and look for seed sources outside of the range. So same 100% to 0%. And what we're seeing is kind of these lower elevation parts of within a 50-kilometer radius, so you're still getting local seed sources, tend to be more resilient seed sources. And we're finding similar patterns for Irvine Ranch and Santa Rosa Plateau. We're finding resilient seed sources within the range, and not so great seed sources within the range, but also seed sources from beyond the range, right? So still local, but if for some reason you want to get outside of the range or you don't have access, you can kind of expand this and find seed sources that will boost resilience just outside of the range. And so we wanted to make specific recommendations for managing these 3 sites. So what we would say for Dangerman, it looks very resilient. So maybe just do land management, remove those invasive species, protect the water sources. But Irvine Ranch might need a really intense restoration, both to increase resilience, but also increase tree cover. And then Santa Rosa Plateau would benefit from this assisted dispersal to kind of increase resilience. So in conclusion, Coast Live Oak is predicted to kind of have this mosaic of vulnerability and resilience across its range, especially in those high elevation and the northernmost and southernmost parts of the range seem to be the most vulnerable. And Irvine Ranch and Santa Rosa Plateau seem to be pretty vulnerable for TNC sites. So maybe increase tree cover, increase resilience. And then patches along the central coast seem to be more resilient, which includes Dangerman Preserve. So maybe just focus on land management that protects and maintains the existing oak populations there. Yeah, so thank you to all my co-authors. Our paper is coming out very soon, I promise. Yeah, and I'll take any questions.
Got a lot of oak fiends in this room, so how about them?
Yeah.
You think about the climate adaptiveness of a seedling versus a mature oak.
Mm-hmm.
And so how well correlated are the adaptive traits as you go across the whole lifespan of one of these long-lived organisms?
That is a great question and a little beyond my field, but our lab is definitely getting at that. And what I think our preliminary results for lobata, at least, so valley oak, our finding is that you can actually track about 2 years. Within 2 years of planting, you're seeing kind of the same predicted response compared to 10 years. So that's good news for kind of restoration common garden sites, right? We'll be able to predict it within 2 years. And you don't have to grow for 10 years and kind of get at that. Yeah, but just to know, this scale kind of just gets at the resolution of climate data. So this is about a 300-meter scale basin characterization model. So we're not able to get at the specific tree level unless we get climate data that is that specific. But yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious about the climate metrics that you put in when you're looking for correlations,
Mm-hmm.
and whether you find sort of maxima or range being better predictors, homes were better correlated with these things.
So we use the 10 climate variables in the basin characterization model, which don't necessarily take into account seasonality or things like that. So I think it is just T max, T min, at least in Coast Live Oak. But we found that for blue oak, for example, it was very important to kind of break the precipitation seasonality. So we ended up doing that, and that seemed to actually be more predictive. As far as for the order of importance, because you can kind of rank how important these climate variables are to this adaptive variation or the SNPs. And for Coast Live Oak, it seemed to be climate water deficit that was the most important to kind of explain this adaptation. So it seems like across the range, at least, the presence of water availability is really what these kind of trees are locally adapted to. Yeah. Yeah.
So oaks are foundational. They also are animal seed dispersal mediated.
Mm-hmm.
And contemplating some of these restoration programs like Irvine Ranch, we also need to be thinking about translocation or enhancement of habitat for seed dispersers to maintain. populations?
Yeah, I mean, that would, if there's no one to disperse the seeds, you know, we would have to do it, but that would be a great idea. And I also think it's kind of hand in hand. If you don't have them there, then they don't have anything to disperse. But also if you don't have the oaks there, then they don't have anything to kind of eat. So yeah, I think oaks are both like a species and a habitat. So it's kind of this question that you have to get at both levels. But yeah, that's a great idea, is kind of like introducing their dispersers as well. Yeah. Thanks.